Welcome! Today, we're jumping into the incredible, centuries-long story of how France was forged. And believe me, it's a tale of weak kings, super powerful nobles, some very unlikely alliances, and a teenage girl who literally changed the course of history. Okay, let's get into it. So, how is a nation really born? For France, it didn't start with some big, grand declaration. Nope. It started with a piece of paper that split an empire and a chain of events that nearly broke the kingdom before it even got off the ground. Our story kicks off with a kingdom that was, well, a kingdom in name only. In reality, it was just this loose collection of rival territories. Each one was ruled by a powerful lord who, most of the time, had way more power than the king himself. Okay, so you can see right here how quickly things started to unravel. It all begins in 843 with the Treaty of Verdun, which creates this territory called West Francia, basically the future France. But just a few decades later, the nobles forced the king to make their lands hereditary. This was a huge blow to royal power. And then, to top it all off, the king had to give a massive chunk of land to Viking raiders just to get them to stop attacking. And just like that, you have Normandy, and another super powerful noble who doesn't really have to listen to the king. So, the bottom line is this complete and total imbalance of power. Early French kings, they were kings on paper. That's it. The real power was with the dukes and the counts. These guys ruled their own lands, they minted their own coins, and they had their own armies. The king was pretty much just one lord among many equals. So how did this all start to turn around? Well, in 987, a new dynasty, the Capetians, takes the throne. They were weak, sure, but they were also really clever. They knew they couldn't take on the nobles head-on, so they started looking for allies in a very unusual place. And here was the king's secret weapon. It wasn't some great army. It was the rise of these independent towns called communes. See, as trade started picking up again, towns got wealthier, and the people in them, the merchants, the artisans, they were tired of being under the thumb of the local feudal lord. They wanted freedom. And this is where the genius win-win strategy comes in. Here's how it worked. Step 1, a town would rebel against its local lord. Step 2, the king would swoop in and grant them a royal charter, basically guaranteeing their freedom. And then step 3, in return for that protection, the towns paid their taxes and gave their loyalty directly to the king. It was a slow but absolutely brilliant way to build a power base that just went right around the nobles. So with this new power base, flush with cash and loyal towns, the kings started getting stronger. By the late 13th century, King Philip IV, also known as Philip the Fair, was feeling strong enough to take on two of the biggest international powers of the day, the papacy and the legendary Knights Templar. The big showdown kicked off when Pope Boniface VIII issued this decree. He was pretty much declaring that every king in Europe was his subordinate, ruling only by his good graces. And, well, you can imagine Philip IV was not about to accept that. This was a clash over the very idea of what France was. Was it a sovereign kingdom with a king who got his power directly from God? Or was it basically just a branch office of a universal church with a king who had to answer to the Pope? Philip's lawyers argued for state sovereignty, which was a pretty radical idea at the time. Philip won this fight, and he won it decisively. He actually forced the entire papacy to move from Rome to Avignon in France, putting it under his control for almost 70 years. Then, to really cement his power and fill up his bank account, he went after another international power. In 1307, on a single day, he had every single Knight Templar in France arrested and he seized their massive fortune. The message was loud and clear. No power, spiritual or military, was above the French crown. But, just as the French crown seemed to be at its strongest, its very existence came under threat. When the last Capetian king died without a direct heir, the King of England, Edward III, claimed the French throne for himself. And that kicked off the devastating 100 Years' War. And you can see right here exactly why France was getting absolutely crushed at the start. The French were stuck in the past, relying on these glorious but totally chaotic charges of heavily armored knights. The English, on the other hand, had this devastatingly effective new weapon, disciplined formations of longbowmen. Their arrows just rained down from the sky, piercing French armor and leading to one catastrophic defeat after another. By the early 1400s, France was on its knees. The English controlled huge parts of the country, including Paris itself. The French heir to the throne, the Dauphin, was in hiding. It really did seem like all was lost. But salvation was about to come from the most unlikely person imaginable, a teenage peasant girl who said she heard the voice of God. Her story is incredibly short, but it changed absolutely everything. In just a little over 2 years, this teenager convinced the uncrowned king of her divine mission. She led the totally demoralized French army to a stunning victory at Orleans, and she stood right by his side as he was finally crowned king. She almost single-handedly turned the tide of the war and gave the French people a reason to believe again.
But her story ends in tragedy. She was captured not by the English, but by their French allies, the Burgundians, and they sold her to the English for 10,000 gold pieces. They put her on trial as a heretic and a witch, mostly to discredit her mission, and then they burned her at the stake.
But Joan's sacrifice was not in vain. Not at all. It inspired this national wave of resistance. The war she had turned around kept going, but now the French were fighting with a new sense of purpose, a new unity. And that, ultimately, led to a final, unified French kingdom. After the war finally ended in 1453, King Louis XI, a guy they called the Universal Spider, came in to finish the job. He kicked out the last English armies, he systematically broke the power of those last great feudal lords, and he expanded the kingdom to something that looks a lot like the France we see on a map today. He created a centralized state, run by royal officials, not by powerful independent nobles. And just like that, the centuries-long struggle was over. The weak, fractured kingdom born from that treaty way back in 843 had finally been forged, through alliances, through betrayals, and through fire and war, into the nation of France. So it really leaves us with this final thought. France was finally whole on the map, sure, but what does it truly take to forge a nation's identity? Is it the grand politics of its kings and the structure of its laws? Or is it something more? Is it the shared sacrifice and the shared belief of its people embodied by someone like Joan of Arc? It's something to think about.